Come on, guys, stop mucking around. We only have 5 minutes until our show
doesn't exist. The song doesn't exist. Time doesn't exist. The wall doesn't exist. Your wrist doesn't exist. The past doesn't exist. The future doesn't exist.
Oh, what's the time?
It doesn't exist. The bath doesn't exist.
What do you mean? We're already clean.
Scrub, scrub, scrub till the water doesn't exist. The ruler doesn't exist. The day doesn't exist. A merry-go-round doesn't exist. A merry-go-round doesn't exist.
The journey
Doesn't exist.
time
Doesn't exist.
Time
Doesn't exist.
Change
Doesn't exist.
time
Doesn't exist.
Time
Doesn't exist.
time
Doesn't exist.
our show.
Doesn't exist.
Stupid
Doesn't exist.
friends
Doesn't exist.
Victorian time
Doesn't exist.
Cobbles
Doesn't exist.
Plague
Doesn't exist.
Speaking in rhyme
Doesn't exist.
Cobbles,
Doesn't exist.
chimneys,
Doesn't exist.
a simpler time.
Doesn't exist. Doesn't exist. Doesn't exist. Doesn't exist. Doesn't exist.
This tree that is old
Doesn't exist.
circles
Doesn't exist.
a tree that is older
Doesn't exist.
The apple that's fresh,
Doesn't exist.
the corn,
Doesn't exist. The moon doesn't exist. The sun doesn't exist.
fun
Doesn't exist.
Time
Doesn't exist.
the place
Doesn't exist.
mucking around
Doesn't exist.
birthday,
Doesn't exist.
Camping.
Doesn't exist.
my dad
Doesn't exist.
The olden days.
Doesn't exist.
Time
Doesn't exist.
history
Doesn't exist.
stuff from the past
Doesn't exist.
a mystery
Doesn't exist.
an old man
Doesn't exist.
computer
Doesn't exist.
Everything
Doesn't exist.
the future
Doesn't exist.
Time
Doesn't exist.
the future
Doesn't exist.
all the wonderful things you can do
Doesn't exist.
gadget
Doesn't exist.
gizmo
Doesn't exist.
email addresses
Doesn't exist.
my dad
Doesn't exist.
the time
Doesn't exist.
7:45.
Doesn't exist. Doesn't exist.
My plate,
Doesn't exist.
8:20
Doesn't exist.
Fish.
Doesn't exist.
my tray
Doesn't exist.
11 to 12.
Doesn't exist.
Fish.
Doesn't exist.
The bath,
Doesn't exist.
9:30.
Doesn't exist.
Fish.
Doesn't exist.
Everywhere.
Doesn't exist.
Fish.
Doesn't exist.
Everywhere.
Doesn't exist.
importance
Doesn't exist.
time
Doesn't exist.
pizza
Doesn't exist.
but when did it start?
and when will it stop
Time doesn't exist.
a clock
Doesn't exist.
Time.
Doesn't exist.
Time.
Doesn't exist.
Time.
Doesn't exist.
The construct of human perception,
Doesn't exist.
an illusion,
Doesn't exist.
sunrise
Doesn't exist.
sunset
Doesn't exist.
Night.
Doesn't exist.
day
Doesn't exist.
the changing seasons
Doesn't exist.
the smell of hay
Doesn't exist.
your hair
Doesn't exist.
isn't it strange how time
Doesn't exist.
your appearance
Doesn't exist.
change
Doesn't exist.